to see so many familiar faces, some of whom go back very, very far. It's always a bit dangerous when, when I'm introduced to give a talk on a serious subject like climate change and the challenges to democracy, and people start talking about having written a book of fiction and having been on the podcast of a comedian, because I worry that you might think that everything I say is fiction or just intentionally funny, and that's actually not so. Today we're actually going to try to grapple with some serious truths. Now, I'm going to begin with some material that I think will be quite familiar to everyone in the room. So just very quickly to go over some of the obvious facts about the climate crisis, really, that we're now facing. As of a week ago, we were at about 410 parts per million off the pre-industrial baseline of about 285 parts per million, according to the Mauna Loa observations. And we know that essentially carbon emissions from fossil fuels have really continued to rise roughly along this same period, that atmospheric concentrations have increased. We had 2 or 3 years where it looked like things were plateauing before we got back to the good times of increasing emissions. And we know that the temperature record has essentially tracked these increases in emissions and increase in atmospheric concentrations. There's a little more noise in the temperature record, hardly surprising given the relative indirectness of what it means to be global mean surface temperature relative to something that can simply be measured, like the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we also know that climate change is going to bring with it an extremely diverse set of impacts that are going to be associated with various levels of warming. So exactly what impacts kick in is going to depend on how far we go with this crazy experiment we're running on the planet. And the intensity of those impacts will also vary depending on how far we go. And I think it's always important to bear in mind that there are real human consequences. It's a talk for another occasion about how it is that so often those of us in the climate change community or the scientific community broadly construed are very happy looking at slides like this, and we often actually lose sight of the real realities that climate change is going to affect, already affecting the livelihoods of millions of people around the world. Now, for the purposes of today's talk, I want to put climate change in the context of the Anthropocene. Now, probably most of you here know about this concept of the Anthropocene. It's gotten enough public play as to hit the cover of The Economist magazine, for example. The Anthropocene is roughly defined as a new epoch in Earth's history in which fundamental Earth systems are dominated by humanity. And again, I think this is a little bit tricky here, but just to run through a few slides really quickly, I think it always helps to remind us what a slender fraction of the Earth's history everything that this human experiment has been about really is. So if we, oh, no, that was the wrong thing to do. Let's see if, oh, well, that was the right thing to do. Good. There's probably a pointer on here. So, is this it? Yeah, good. Hey, wow, it even works. Okay, so if the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, life has really only existed on the planet for a little bit more than half of that period. And the so-called age of mammals, the Cenozoic, really is a small fraction of that, about 66 million years. Now, in the Cenozoic, oh, I did it again. Okay, stupid me. Now in the Cenozoic period, we only get the transition from hominid species to apes at about 5.3 million years ago. And of that period, we really only get anatomically modern humans it's really at about 200,000 years ago that it's usually dated, but between 100 and 200,000 years ago. So we're really talking about fractions of fractions of fractions of fractions here. And in this period, since there have been anatomically modern humans, about 200,000 years, there's really only a tiny fraction of that period where almost everything that we associate with human culture and civilization has come into existence. And that's this brief period that we call the Holocene, and is usually dated as about the last 11,600 years. Now, if we drill down on the Holocene, what we see is that the Holocene is not a period of stability, at least in terms of human life. It's been this period of really enormous and really exponential change as human populations have increased from just a few million people to now more than 7 billion people in really what amounts to the blinking of an eye, given the kinds of timescales that we've been talking about. And part of why I think it's helpful to put this whole discussion in the context of the Anthropocene is because the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the disruption of the carbon cycle, is really only just one of the cycles that have been disrupted during this period. We can talk about nitrogen, we can talk about methane, we can talk about all of these essentially physical science indicators that all themselves are associated with socioeconomic trends. So we're seeing the same kind of exponential sort of jumping off the page across a whole range of indicators, both physical indicators and socioeconomic indicators. It's not just carbon and it's not just climate change that are really the matters of our concern. And so this is not actually the slide I thought it was, but it does make the same point. To me personally, this idea of the Anthropocene is communicated most directly by looking at the biomass of terrestrial mammals and to see how much of that biomass is essentially under human control and how much remains what we call wild. And essentially, the wild mammal biomass is indicated by the little green bits in each of these classes of animals. And so what you see is that if we use weight, biomass as the measure, essentially, almost all of the terrestrial mammalian biomass is, at this point, under human control. The whole idea of wild animals, in terms of charismatic megafauna, barely exist now as measured by biomass. And sometimes you still, especially in the humanities and social sciences, you still get sort of resistance to this idea of the Anthropocene for reasons I'm happy to talk about in discussion. Sometimes people claim to, well, especially environmental historians like this little trick, well, things have never changed, like 9,000 years, all this was happening then. Like, why are you drawing these lines, this kind of stuff. And I just go like, oh, well, this is the slide I actually wanted to show. It's the same thing, it's just got a better caption. Okay. Oh, well, if it's good enough for one, it's good enough for two. Okay, and so if people say they don't know what the Anthropocene is, I just say, look, dude, look at this slide. And essentially, this is Manhattan Island, and on the left, it looks more or less the way it did when Henry Hudson sailed up the Hudson River in 1607. Essentially, it was very lightly managed by the Lenape Indians, but essentially the dominant forms of species were species that we would consider wild species, not under human control. On the right is the Manhattan that we know and love today. If you claim not to understand the difference between the Holocene and the Anthropocene, then it seems to me you claim not to understand the difference between the left side of this picture and the right side of this picture. This is what we're talking about when we talk about the Anthropocene. Now, we have some people who think actually the Anthropocene is a good idea. One of them is Earl Ellis, a geographer who writes things like, for the first time, we're changing the way the entire planet functions. This is an amazing opportunity, right? And we have people who think the Anthropocene is not such a good idea, and they dress accordingly. This is a philosopher, Ned Hedinger, who basically thinks this whole idea of the human domination of nature is both overplayed in terms of its extent and also to the degree at which humanity does dominate nature. It's not a good thing at all. Now, I'm not going to get into this debate in this talk about whether the Anthropocene is good, bad, or indifferent, although I'm happy to talk about that in discussion. I more or less, for the purposes of this talk, want to just take the Anthropocene as a fact, that this is, whether you think about this geologically or culturally or some mix of the two, I don't really care. There's something different about this world that we're living in now, as indicated by all of these charts jumping off the page. And that really provides the background for what I want to talk about today. And this period of the Anthropocene, again, good, bad, and different, is certainly a period of great risk. When we destabilize these natural systems in this way, when we increase consumption and population in the way that we've done so, even if we get through this period without any major catastrophes, it is at least a period of great risk. It's also going to be a period, and is a period, of great mourning. The rapidity of natural change is a little bit like the psychological emotional equivalent of the bulldozers knocking down your high school as soon as you graduate, right? I mean, there's a sense of loss of identity, a loss of place, a difficulty of sort of situating yourselves in a world that's familiar to you, that you know, that's very difficult then to pass on to future generations. And we're seeing, I think, already a lot of mourning about the loss of a lot of the natural world as we came to understand it and to experience it. But also, what's really striking about the Anthropocene is the extent to which it's characterized by banality. And banality is relevant here at really two different levels. First of all, what's driving the Anthropocene is not Dr. Evil, conspiring against the planet. It's not Smersh, that has, for those of you who remember the James Bond movies, right, who has, some plan to take over the world. What's essentially driving the Anthropocene are people going about their ordinary business, so consuming and producing, living the good life, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you might think, and again, this is the topic for another discussion, that, well, okay, banality on the part of consumers, but what about those evil corporations, right? They're the sort of Smershes of today, they're the Dr. Evils of today. And we can talk about questions of responsibility here, individual, corporate, and governmental, but the fact is, if the automobile manufacturers could sell gas guzzlers, and if Exxon could sell gasoline, and they could just cancel the climate change impacts of these behaviors, they'd be all over that. They'd be very, very happy to do that. Nobody wants really to change the climate. Not us as individuals, nor corporations as corporate actors. This is produced, these outcomes are produced by people going about business as usual, essentially. And that's why, as you know, in the climate change business, we often talk about business as usual scenarios, right? That's what they are. It's people just doing what it is that they do. Now, there's another dimension to the banality of climate change, which is unless we really go to the darkest part of the risk possibilities, for many people, the impacts of climate change, at least for the foreseeable future, and of some of these Anthropocene changes, is itself going to be banal. You're going to have to pay more for chocolate. Good coffee may be harder to find. But for people in the rich parts of the world, you may have to pay more taxes to protect, your nice house on the beach. Miami may come to resemble Venice, which has its advantages as well as its disadvantages, right? But for rich people in rich parts of the world, to some extent, life will go on as usual. They'll just grumble more about the taxes. They'll get upset about the more homeless people washing up on, hanging around on their doorsteps, and so on. But to some extent, unless we go to the darkest place, it will be business as usual. And at this point, I think it's always good for us to remember that catastrophe isn't really something in the future. Catastrophe is happening at present for tens of millions of people all over the world. It isn't a hypothetical. So, The irony of the Anthropocene is that it is both a sign of power and a sign of impotence. Humanity collectively is changing the world, but we're changing the world in ways that we don't want, and we don't seem to know how to stop. So the paradox of the Anthropocene, then, which I will come back to at the end of the talk, is that the Anthropocene is this period of the collective human domination of nature, which goes along with it a sense of a loss of human agency. So weirdly, for many people, never has human change been so dramatic, and never has a sense of powerlessness over affecting that change been greater. Okay, so what can we do to take control? So now we're going to go back to focusing on climate change, now that we've seen climate change against the broader background of the Anthropocene. But what can we do then to try to restore agency, to try to adapt to and to mitigate the most serious risks of climate change? Well, one response is democracy. And so this is a fairly characteristic headline that I think was published in Foreign Affairs. Democracy is the answer to climate change. Contrary to popular belief, elected leaders are better equipped to address the problem than their autocratic rivals. Now, in this particular piece, I get singled out as one of the bad guys here, along with Jim Lovelock, as someone who questions whether democracy is up to the challenge of climate change at all, and scientist Jim Lovelock is similarly pessimistic. Now, if we're going to think about democracy and whether or not it's really up to the challenge of addressing these problems of the Anthropocene, I think we first have to think about what actual democracy would be like, as opposed to the seriously flawed democracy that we live in. Now, there's this famous remark attributed to Gandhi. I have no idea whether it's true, so I don't want to be thought to sort of be, recycling urban legends. This may be an urban legend. I don't know. It doesn't matter. The point is a good point, I think. But the story is that Gandhi was once asked by a reporter what he thought of Western civilization, and his reply was that he thought it would be a very good idea, and as it's usually reported, somebody should try it sometime. And I feel a little that way about democracy, at least as we experience it in the United States, and I think a similar story could also be told about the United Kingdom, and perhaps other societies as well. And I think the polite thing to say is, at the very least, we experience democratic deficits in our political system. Now, it would be a mistake to think that democracy simply means majority rule. It's not that simple. But it does seem reasonable to suppose that if you're going to have a democracy, there should at least be some majoritarian institution in the governance structure of that society. And actually, in the United States at this moment, we have no majoritarian institutions. So let's go through this quickly. The Supreme Court is not a majoritarian institution, was never set up to be a majoritarian institution, and I don't think, well, almost no one would argue that it ought to simply translate majority preferences into legal decisions. Fair enough. Now, it came to a big surprise to many people in 2000, and again, a big surprise to many people in 2016, that among the many great colleges we have in the United States, one of them is the Electoral College. And twice in 4 electoral cycles, the Electoral College produced presidents who did not win a plurality, much less a majority of the popular vote. So the election of the chief executive in the United States is not a majoritarian process. But probably less known to people is that Congress is also not a majoritarian institution. And we could go back and we could analyze the data from other elections. But if you just analyze the data from 2016, in the Senate elections, the Democrats actually won 56% of the vote, but the Republicans won 65% of the seats. That's pretty shocking when you actually look at it that way. The House of Representatives, which is usually billed as the closest thing to a majoritarian institution that we have in our system of government, is one that in 2016, the Republicans won a little less than 49% of the vote, but yet won more than 55% of the seats. There were no active majoritarian institutions in the United States political system in 2016. And the reasons for this are not very complicated. There's a kind of small, part of this is gerrymandering, which I'm not even going to talk about at all. But part of it has to do with the structural advantage that goes with small states. So as we know that every state, for example, has at least one representative despite its population. It has 2 senators despite its population. And since the number of electors it has in this wonderful college, namely the Electoral College, is simply the sum of its senators and representatives, the small state advantage gets translated into the Electoral College as well. And perhaps the most, or one of the most pernicious things about this particular form of anti-majoritarianism is that the small state advantage also translates into a white privilege advantage as well, because white voters tend to concentrate in small states, and non-white voters tend to concentrate in large states. So if you just analyze voting power in terms of the Electoral College, what you see is that non-Hispanic whites essentially have greater voting power than you would expect on the sense of one person, one vote. And minorities in various degrees have less voting power. And actually, the voting power is actually even, difference is actually even more exaggerated than that if you actually look at swing states, but that's another story. Now, another oddity about the American political system is our relatively low voter turnout. There are all sorts of ways of trying to deal with this, including, for example, having elections on Sundays or elections on holidays, or the Australian system of mandatory voting. But as a result of our relatively low turnout, voter turnout and suppression actually become the core political strategies of both major political parties. The name of the game really in politics isn't to convince people that your candidate is better than their candidate. The core political strategy of both political parties is to get their lot to the polls and to do everything they can to keep the other lot from actually getting to the polls. And this is essentially the story of the 2016 election, presidential election. So what you actually see here, if you compare 2012 to 2016, is essentially an uptick in white voter turnout and a downtick in black voter turnout, and bingo. That's essentially, at one level of analysis, that explains the electoral results. Now, probably the best analysis of the election is in a book which I think is still not yet published by the political scientist John Sides and colleagues. And the blurb of the book they've presented and published on this material so far, but the book I think is still in press. But the blurb of the book pretty much says it all. Identity crisis reveals how Trump's victory was foreshadowed by changes in the Democratic and Republican coalitions that were driven by people's racial and ethnic identities. The campaign then reinforced and exacerbated those cleavages as it focused on issues relating to race, immigration, and religion. And so, I'm going to go over this very quickly to just give you a few of the data slides on which this material is based. So sometimes it's said that it was really high economic anxiety that drove the Trump vote, but it actually had no effect as a predictive probability. And that was actually a change from the election of 2012. What did predict Trump voting was essentially anti-black racial animus among white respondents. as measured by racial resentment attitudes and black influence animosity. And if you look at perceptions of bias across party lines, you really begin to see just how deeply divided this country really is. So if you ask Republicans and Democrats what groups they think are most discriminated against and how discriminated against, and whether they're discriminated against, Muslims rank highest for Democrats, and Democrats think that very few Democrats think that there's much discrimination against either whites or Christians. But among Republicans believe that fewer Republicans believe that there's a lot of discrimination against blacks than they believe that there is discrimination against any other group. And as you will see, more Republicans actually think that there's a lot of discrimination against Christians than against Muslims or immigrants, blacks, gays, lesbians, or trans people even, for that matter. So this is really the sort of thing that drives voting behavior that was on display in the election of 2016. But we can, so I think, so far we've been actually talking about democratic deficits, about, well, maybe if we had a more perfect democracy, maybe it would be better able to respond to problems like climate change. But there are more fundamental questions about whether democracy is itself part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And if you go back and look at the history of political thought, democracy has actually not been very popular throughout most of the history of Western political thought. The two greatest critics of democracy were probably Plato on the left, yes, and Thomas Hobbes on the right. And the objections that Plato and Hobbes had to democracy, I think, still have a high degree of resonance today. Plato, in particular, emphasized the ignorance of voters, right? That voters are just simply not up to self-rule. Sorry. And in a recent book by Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels, this is all sort of put in a little more political science-y jargon, but in a book called Democracy for Realists, essentially they're saying just get over this idea that elections are supposed to be about, as they put it, the familiar ideal of thoughtful citizens steering the ship of state from the voting booth is fundamentally misguided. They demonstrate that voters, even those who are well-informed and politically engaged, mostly choose parties and candidates on the basis of social identities and partisan loyalties, not political issues. So essentially what they're saying is that what was documented about the Trump election in 2016 was just a kind of particularly virulent and nasty version of the way that voters typically make political choices in democracies. There's also an issue about administrative incompetence. So Plato says, look, so the voters all vote for somebody for whatever reason, because they're ignorant. And there's no reason to think that the person who's the most popular, who gets the most votes, is actually competent to run the government. And I think this is a Doonesbury strip, and I think it brings out really well why it is that winning an election isn't necessarily an indication of administrative competence. So Roland Headley Jr., who many of you might remember, goes back a long ways in Doonesbury, says, if true that POTUS is semi-literate, big win for democracy. Now even fourth grade dropout can dream of having the biggest button one day. Right? So it's kind of a democratic, anybody can grow up and be president, right? Even a semi-literate fourth grade dropout, not bad. But where the rubber really hits the road here is that a lot of us actually tend to think of liberalism and democracy as going together, where liberalism is traditionally conceived involves the protection of individual rights, for example, from the oppression of the public sphere. But there is actually no necessary relation between democracy and a liberal state. So, as even Thomas Jefferson wrote, a democracy is nothing more than mob rule. where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49%. That's what you have in democracy, unless you have some protections for minority rights, which is why Jefferson favored a Bill of Rights. And essentially the same point is being made in this cartoon, which also goes off in lots of other fun and interesting directions. Now this debate was had in the 1920s between Walter Lippmann and John Dewey, who were the two greatest public intellectuals of their time. And they both saw the same problem. They both recognized that there was a very, very deep tension between liberalism and democracy. Lippmann thought that democracy could never actually provide the strong guarantees for a liberal state that you wanted. And so Lippmann favored a system of much more sort of what you might call indirect democracy, in which you had various spaces for essentially elite, expertise-driven institutions inside the government that were insulated from popular will. Dewey was pretty much a radical Democrat, but he understood the criticisms of democracy. And what's interesting when you read Dewey now, 100 years later almost, is now he almost sounds like Che Guevara or something, right? The old socialist theoreticians of the 60s and 70s, the communist theoreticians said essentially, look, communism is a wonderful ideal, but of course, normal, regular, flawed human beings are not really good enough to implement a communist state. So what we need, and this is a phrase from Che Guevara, what we need is the new socialist man. We need to educate people. We need to change people. We need to create a citizenry that's actually capable of implementing the socialist utopia. Dewey's the same way about democracy, essentially, if you read Dewey. He recognizes all of these objections to democracy that are in the tradition of Plato and Hobbes, and he says, but yes, it's true, people really aren't up to democracy. They're not up to self-rule. And that's why we need, and this is where you get the connection to Dewey that some people know, the focus on education in Dewey. We actually need to create citizens that are capable of being self-governed, that can actually function as democratic citizens. And arguably what's happened in the last century is we've sort of absorbed Dewey's democratic ethos without the condition that there's a price of admission to actually trying to have something like a functioning democracy. Now these are all the old challenges that exist for democracy always, under all conditions. But what happens in the Anthropocene is that we have these particular pressures that come to bear on democratic governance. And these pressures involve essentially the erasure of boundaries between nation states and between governing polities. So in some cases, this erasure of boundaries involves things like economic globalization, but in other cases, they simply involve the kinds of changes in the atmosphere, the kinds of changes in the biological endowment of the planet that can occur in any part of the world and essentially affect every part of the world. And they also affect the possibility of global governance. So, arguably, that for quite a long time since the adoption of the Framework Convention in 1992, on the part of 193 nations and the European Union, the largest single obstacle, arguably, to really effective international global action on climate change have been the worst 34 members of the United States Senate. And so another problem, another pressure that the Anthropocene brings to bear is when you have these global problems that seem to require global governance. They're held hostage by the political facts on the ground of particular nation states. So what we face then, I think, are a series of interlocking crises, and I'll try to go over these very quickly. Democratic polities are not particularly good at multilateralism in the first place for reasons that we can suggest, in part because the democratic leaders of nation states are fundamentally responsible to their electorate, not to some broader constituency. There is obviously a high degree of short-termism that is involved in a democratic electoral system. Also, in at least a democratic electoral system like ours, there is a very, very large number of veto players. Veto players are essentially individuals or institutions who are capable of preventing an innovative policy from being implemented. Because power is relatively dispersed in a democracy, there is a large population of entities that are capable of vetoing change and innovation. There is, intrinsic to democracy, at least many people have argued, a contested role of expertise. And the argument is sort of like this, that if you have essentially what you're saying about a democracy is that everybody's opinion about leadership is as good as everyone else's opinion. Every vote counts the same. So who are you, Mr. Climate Scientist, to tell me what I should think about X, Y, or Z? This is a democracy in which everyone's voice is supposed to be equal. Now, there are ways of dealing with that issue. I'm not saying that that kind of argument is just a knockdown argument that you have to fall for. But the point is that in a democracy, the question of where expertise fits is always going to be contested because of the fundamental presuppositions of a democracy, that the basic principle of governance is one of equality in terms of input into the system. And if you look back through American history, generally what you will see is essentially just that. The contested role of experts that we now have in the Trumpocene is hardly novel in American history. This is something which has come and gone to varying degrees in American history. So, and what I mean by self-referring decision-making is essentially the great insight of democracy was that government should essentially rule in the interests of the governed, those who elect them. But by definition, that excludes the interests of people who are beyond the boundaries of the political entity. It excludes future people who are not represented. It excludes animals, nature, et cetera, who are not voting members of the polity that's making decisions that affect them. So it's not surprising, then, if you look at things from the perspective that I've been urging, that we're seeing this rising tide of populism. It's driven by many things, but one of the things, arguably, that it's being driven by is the inability of avowedly democratic nation states to meaningfully address the problems of the Anthropocene. And so there's a lot of talk now about the crises of democracy, which is something we can talk about in more detail. But the point that I want to make as we sort of move toward the end of this talk is that democracy historically has founded its legitimacy on the consent of the governed. And so liberal political theory then has always recognized the right to resist and even overthrow illegitimate political power. Now this is different from monarchies or certain kinds of aristocratic forms of government, which basically say, look, dude, it doesn't matter whether you like what we're doing. Our legitimacy comes from God, or our legitimacy comes from expertise, or something like that. In democracy, legitimacy has always come from the idea of popular sovereignty, so the right of revolution is always there. And in fact, this right has been used to justify historical events that liberals and Democrats typically applaud, the French Revolution, the American Revolution. But here's the really deepest risk, I think. Unable to find consistent responses to challenges to their own legitimacy in the Anthropocene, liberal democracies may well be in danger of warranting revolutions against themselves and their own institutions. Liberal democratic regimes, by their own lights, may in fact become the ancien regime. And in effect, that's what's being said by this by this cast of characters, by the new populace, in effect. They're claiming their legitimacy from popular sovereignty, and the idea is that the liberal institutions that they are trying to sweep away in various parts of the world are justified on democratic grounds. Okay, so I'm not going to say very much about how we might respond to that, but in some sense, what I've been saying is that the core problem of the Anthropocene has to do with this loss of a sense of agency. So the right answer, in some way, must be about the recovery of a sense of agency. I've got some ideas of how to do that, some of which I've discussed in a book called Reason in a Dark Time, and in other places as well. But I think I've gone on long enough, so I'm going to stop now. So thank you very much for your patience.